Can she?
Oh, I did make a waiting room.
I mean, I can.
I can't log into somewhere else because I'm actually logged in here.
Oh, okay.
Well, no, I guess if it's just from the link, I could.
You can steal my computer if you need. I have it.
Just good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Foster at the Kentucky Climate Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone that is joining us for this first Kentucky Monthly Climate Perspective webinar highlighting drought and hydrologic conditions. And certainly good that we have the hydrologic conditions in there given current conditions around the state. Like to get a sense of audience here today. I hope we have several folks joined, and Megan Schargorodski is going to be here with me to help manage this. This is the first time we've done it, so we may have a few hiccups along the way, but we hope you're able to hear. If you have any problems, feel free to reach out to us. I think by email. Do we have a way where they can contact us?
During this, there is a chat box associated with Zoom. If you could type any questions you have that come up during the presentation, then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
Okay. With that, then I think we'll go ahead and get started. I would like to emphasize that this first webinar is something of a dry run, in the sense that again, we want to go through the process. We have some content that we've selected to cover, but we're very interested in feedback from each one of you as to what information is useful, what we need to add, and that sort of thing. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end here for questions and discussion. And then afterwards, you're certainly welcome to, and in fact, encouraged to provide. Let's go ahead and get started. Get the slide to advance. There we go. Okay. So general information, I want to note that support for this webinar series was provided via a grant to the Kentucky Climate Center at Western Kentucky University from the National Integrated Drought Information System in conjunction with the Midwest Drought Early Warning System. Also note that production and delivery of this webinar reflects the contributions of many partners committed to serving the needs of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and its people. On the title slide, we had identified some of those partners, but I think there are a lot more folks out there, and if you're contributing information or if you and your organization are helping to disseminate information and engage others in this webinar series, we would be very much interested in recognize you and including your logo as part of our webinars. Our next regularly scheduled webinar will be the first Thursday in June. That's June 6th, and we'll stick with the 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Central Time for the beginning. And this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing. We're still working out the details on where we're going to archive or how to link to these, but we will have that information available to you. Okay. An outline for today, we will be talking about recent conditions, looking at temperature, mainly precipitation, soil moisture, stream flow, drought conditions. We'll talk briefly about impacts across the state of the current conditions, and then get into outlooks, sub-monthly outlooks for the days ahead, and then the monthly outlook for May, and we'll take a look a little farther ahead at a 3-month window for May, June, and July, and then a brief summary of what we've gone through, and then have some time for questions and discussion. I included the pictures there on the left side. Those are a couple shots from Wickliffe, high on the hill there, and looking northward at the Mississippi River, and a tale of two very different situations. April 17th, I was there in Ballard County recently and got over to take a picture of the Mississippi, and water levels were high. Some of the adjacent areas were flooded. You can't see that so much in this image. But in contrast to that, go back to July of 2012, our last significant drought, and there were sandbars visible throughout long stretches of the river, and navigation was very much impacted by that. So we're in a situation now where we're concerned about flooding, and just represents the cyclical nature of our climate and the importance of being able to monitor and keep tabs on what conditions are and what outlooks are hinting for us. Start out with a summary of precipitation over the last 30 days. You're looking at a map that shows radar estimated precipitation totals in the map shaded colors, and then laying on top of that are the observed precipitation totals for that 30-day period, observations from the Kentucky Mesonet stations across the state. And if you look at those numbers, first of all, you will see that the radar estimates do a pretty good job of getting us in the ballpark as to what those precipitation totals are. Of course, those radar estimates are calibrated using gauge data to help make sure that they're not biased any more than is possible. And you look at that map, you can see, first of all, statewide over the last month, we've been kind of average out near normal precipitation. But again, as you go across the state, you see some areas that have been above normal. And again, normal, we're talking about something in the 4 to 5 inch range in much of the state, maybe a little bit less in some other areas climatologically. But precipitation amounts over 7 inches in some locations along the Ohio River, moving up toward the Louisville area and on up towards Cincinnati. And then the western part of the state being wetter than the east. We have some relatively drier conditions in the eastern half part of the bluegrass and eastern Kentucky. But again, that's a fairly recent development. This next slide, we're looking at the same map, but now we've added a few time series plots of precipitation from some Kentucky mesonet stations. And these, again, just selected sites to kind of capture some of the variability. One thing to note as you look at the time series graphs, the scaling on each graph is independent of the others. So you can't just look at one graph and at the height of the line and compare it to another. But if we look at the one in the west, southwest, that's looking at the station in Callaway County. And you can see out in the western part of the state, a significant precipitation event there in the middle of the month, or around the 13th or so, and then a little bit later on in the month. But precipitation well distributed and about 5 inches, a little bit 5 inches for the month. As you can look at that, really 3 major periods separated by about a week, so well-spaced precipitation. And then as you go a little bit farther north at the top there, there's a graph from Meade County. And again, you can see that precipitation was well-spaced throughout the month, but during one period in particular, between the 18th and 20th, heavy precipitation produced close to 4 inches of rain over a 3-day period. And that led to a total precipitation of over 7 inches, approaching 8 inches for the month. And again, that station was representative of an area in that portion of the state. If you go over to eastern part of the state, there's a station highlighted in Knott County, and precipitation totals are much smaller there. We're looking again at well-spaced precipitation throughout the month, but totals in each case being less than an inch for those independent events. We move on to the next slide, and we are looking at a 60-day accumulated precipitation. And here we see amounts that are, again, lighter throughout eastern Kentucky and into central Kentucky, with higher amounts in the western part of the state, and then up along the Ohio River, really from far west up through the Cincinnati area. In those areas, we have 60-day totals that are in the range of 10 to 11 inches of precipitation, which puts us a bit above normal. Whereas again, in the eastern part of the state, the central part, you've got amounts that are in the 5 to 6 inch range, and those amounts are near normal, but probably a bit below normal throughout that part of the state. Really, if we were to compare the 30-day and 60-day patterns, they're very similar. It's really reflect pretty much a continuation of the same type of pattern through both the month of March and of April in terms of precipitation. This last of the 3 sets of cumulative precipitation maps shows the 90-day precipitation totals with the radar estimates and the mesonet values laid over top. Now, when we go back to 90 days, we're getting back to include the month of February. And you may recall that February was a particularly wet month, an extraordinarily wet month across Kentucky. There were locations, particularly in the western part of the state, that had as much as 15 inches of rain during that short month of February. And so when we look at this map, you see totals there that are over 20 inches into the mid-20s in the Jackson Purchase region, and lighter amounts as you move back to eastern Kentucky. But in general, precipitation amounts were heavy in February, and so that 90-day total indicates a general wetness across the state. This next slide tries to capture some of what we've just looked at, but instead of looking at total precipitation, we are looking at precipitation as a percent of normal for the 30-day, 60-day, and 90-day periods. When you're looking at these maps, the tan colors are right around normal precipitation and just slightly above, and the light yellow colors are near normal to slightly below. So where you see those colors, tan to pale yellow, we're right about where we should be in terms of climatology. As you see the brighter yellow, those are areas that have been drier, down to about 75% of normal precipitation. And as you get up into the greens and especially the blues, we're looking at areas that have been particularly wet. So again, this highlights, if you look at the 30-day and 60-day maps kind of side by side there, you can see that the pattern is roughly similar, especially in the eastern half of the state, that we've got areas that are near normal to maybe a little bit below normal. There are higher amounts along the Ohio River and in the western half of the state. When you drop down to that 90-day period, now you're looking at precipitation totals that are well above normal. And again, the green amounts, the darker green, are 125 to 150% of normal. We get into the blues that are 150 to 200% of normal. So again, it's been a very wet start to 2019, but moving back more recently, the last couple of months, to a more normal precipitation regime. Talk just briefly about temperatures. Temperatures are not a major issue at this time of year in terms of water demand. This slide is looking at the Midwest region. These maps are produced by the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and the one on the left is highlighting the average maximum temperatures and showing departure from mean, and the map on the right is showing departures from mean for the average minimum temperatures. And in both cases, you can see that Kentucky, depending on where you are, is ranging anywhere from about 1 degree to 4, or even in a few places 5 degrees above normal on both the average daily high and average daily low temperatures. And again, that's over the 30-day period from April 2nd to May 1st. If you just think back here a little bit over the last few days, we've had temperatures in many areas well into the 80s. And so if you consider those last few days, that's really helped to ramp up those temperature averages above normal. The next slide is highlighting soil moisture conditions, and we're looking at a couple products here. On the left, you have a product from the National Weather Service's Climate Prediction Center, and on the right, a NASA-based product. And there are a number of different soil moisture products out here. I selected these two to be representative of a couple different approaches, and also just in terms of looking at clarity, the ability to look at and interpret the map. So on the left side, from the Climate Prediction Center, we're looking at soil moisture rankings in terms of percentiles that are based on observational data, in situ data from stations, and that data is plugged into models, hydrologic model that basically gives estimates and then interpolates those across the state. Note that these are very coarse in terms of taking into account weather, climate, soil characteristics. But you can see that soil moisture values across Kentucky, and in fact much of the region, are in the 80 to approaching 90% percentile. So wet conditions, and that's looking at a long-term period that goes back 30 to 40 years or so. And on the right, you're looking at soil moisture model estimates based on satellite imagery with some ground data factored in there for calibration purposes. Key thing here is in both cases, you see what we know, what is evident from looking outside, that it's been wet and our soil holds a lot of moisture. And that's important certainly right now in terms of implications for outdoor operations and agriculture and potential runoff from flooding. But it's also important as an indicator going down the road here as we move towards summer about available moisture to the atmosphere. Okay. This next slide highlights soil moisture from a couple Kentucky mesonet sites where we have soil probes installed. And these graphs are pretty busy. There's a lot here. I just selected a couple locations to kind of highlight that difference between the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state that we saw earlier on some of the precipitation maps. First of all, as you look at both of these, Fulton County, we're over on the Mississippi River, and then Boyle County, so we're in Danville, and south of Lexington, kind of central eastern part of the state. Each graph is showing a 12-month period. So on the right end, you're looking at current conditions, and as you go to the left, you're looking at where we were a year ago at this time. Now you've got several lines on there, and those represent soil moisture measurements at different depths in the soil. If you look at the legend on the bottom, you'll note that the pale blue is soil moisture at 2 inches, which should be very volatile to precipitation events, and then solar radiation and evaporation. 4 inches, likewise, pretty sensitive. As you move to the right, the red is 20-inch depth. It's going to be a little slower to respond in general, and 40 inches in the yellow to orange color should be the most stable in terms of soil moisture. So note that these are different soil types. I don't have that information in front of me. We do have that, but different soil types, they behave differently to precipitation and evapotranspiration and such. So you can't necessarily directly compare one graph to the next. But in looking at these, the thing to point out is that when you're looking at Fulton County, again, on the left side, you're looking at last year at this time as we entered May. And I guess the line that really stands out to me to kind of follow is that 20-inch line. And you can see that as we got into the summer, things were pretty wet. We were about 40% content by soil moisture. And as we went through the summer into the end of July and August, that dropped down to about 25%. We started to see some recharge as precipitation returned there in the latter half of 2018, and 2019 has been wet from the get-go, especially in the western part of the state. And you can see that soil moisture, that 20-inch level is notably higher than it was this time last year. And really all the different depths have been high from the winter and really haven't dried out to speak of yet, haven't started drawing. On the right-hand side, you see in Boyle County, you see first of all, a little bit more differentiation in terms of the different depths. And at the bottom, that's the 4-inch moisture that is the lowest there, the 20-inch higher, and again, more moisture down deep. But the key thing there is that's been a lot steadier across the year's time. And again, more recently, we started to see a little bit of drying in the last month or so. You can see a little bit of dip there, especially at the 2- and 4-inch levels. So highlight or point out that we have soil monitoring at many of our stations across the state, and encourage you to be able to access that data on our website. So we talked about precipitation, we talked about soil moisture. We'll move on and talk a little bit about stream flows. Here you're looking at a map from U.S. Geological Survey that shows the 7-day stream flow average. So it removes a little bit of the flashiness from daily amounts, so it's average over a 7-day period. If you look at that, you see primarily a lot of green, and then that's indicating that we're basically around normal flows, anywhere from 25th to 75th percentile based on long-term observations. We've got a few locations there that are a little bit below normal in the eastern part of the state where we've had less precipitation over the last couple of months. And of course, we get over the eastern part of the state, we get into some streams, and I don't know these particular gauges, but you get higher into the drainage basins near the head of some of those basins, and so some of those may be a little flashier. And as we get up toward the Ohio River and some of those areas where we saw heavier precipitation amounts over the last 30 days, we've got some streams that are running above normal in those areas. There's one anomaly over there in McCracken County around Paducah, and I have no explanation for that. If somebody on the call does, we would be welcome that input here later on. So that's a 7-day average. And now we'll shift and look at a little bit longer period. This is the same map, but we're looking at a 28-day average of stream flows. And here the general message is about the same. Most areas are about normal. We have a few locations, there are different ones in the east that are running a little bit below normal. And we have more locations now from the Ohio River out over more of western Kentucky, including much of the Pennyrile area and the Green River area that are in the above normal category. And again, that's 28 days. We don't see as much of that on the 7 days, indicating that some of those stream flows are starting to drop back down closer to normal. This map from water.weather.gov, National Weather Service NOAA product, shows gauges across Kentucky and the surrounding states based on flood status. And we see at this point that not too much activity in Kentucky. We've got one gauge with indicating moderate flooding there over on the Mississippi around Wickliffe in Ballard County, and then some areas that are near flood stage over on the Ohio in the McCracken, Livingston County area. But otherwise, no major concerns at present. Move on from flooding and too much water to the other case of not enough water. Here's the current U.S. Drought Monitor that was just released this morning, and represents conditions through or as of April 30th. You look at that map, and what stands out is the lack of drought across the country, and not just in Kentucky. Going back to, I believe, about 1999, when Drought Monitor was created, and we've been tracking drought conditions and tabulating percentage of the country that is in different stages of drought. And we're looking at a record low in terms just a little over 2% of the country in drought status of some type. So remarkable in the lack of coverage of drought across the country. If we look again in our region, we see in the southeast, across part of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida Panhandle, we have some areas that are abnormally dry, a little bit of moderate drought there. There's been some discussion about that area on recent calls with the Drought Monitor folks. It's something we're keeping our eye on. If we look at this next map, it's showing change in the Drought Monitor status over a 1-month period. So as we've completed April, we can see that areas that are highlighted in green are areas where we saw an improvement of drought conditions, drought disappearing off the map, a 1 class, in some cases a 2 class improvement. The yellow areas are showing a degradation where we're starting to see dryness develop, and then the gray area, as indicated there, is no change. So as you look there in the southeast, it's an area we've got our eye on, but there's, we don't see any particular momentum there in terms of drought intensification and such at this point. So we'll keep an eye on that going throughout the year, but at this point it's not giving any particular indication of concern for us. And this slide in here is pretty much just a placeholder. We can't get any better than this from a drought perspective, that we don't have any coverage in the state at this time. And looking at that and kind of wrapping up our assessment of current conditions, this is a time series produced from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center that shows the 24-month standardized precipitation index. So this is basically an index that factors in a running 2-year period, 24 months of rainfall or precipitation, and looks at it in historical perspective. As you look at that time series, first of all, you note that it goes back to 1890s. And so we're looking at basically 120 plus years of record. And looking at the present time, we are in a remarkably wet period in Kentucky. So the 24-month SPI indicates that we've been essentially above normal precipitation in terms of an extended 24-month wet period ever since before 2010. And as you look at that graph, you'll note that that has not happened before in Kentucky in terms of the period of record. So we look at our climate, and when it comes to drought, we think of drought as a cyclical, recurrent phenomenon. And so what it's suggesting is that while we're not in a period of frequent drought now, we know historically that they happen, and they're likely to come back. And the longer that we stay in this wet period, the more desensitized we become to the next drought whenever it comes. So moving on from current conditions, we've got just 2 or 3 slides here talking a little bit about impacts. And this first slide is a compilation of storm reports, local storm reports that come into National Weather Service. These are provided by a range of people from National Weather Service employees, emergency managers. They can come from other sources. So this is, again, a compilation of storm reports for that 30-day period, and then just highlighting a few things. You can see that in the area from Louisville up towards Cincinnati, that area was impacted a couple times during the month. On the 12th, severe thunderstorms, 1 tornado, damaging winds in many areas there. And then later in the month, on the 24th and 25th, another round of storms that included some hail in some locations there. The western part of the state, a lot of symbols there indicating heavy rains, and that was around the 14th of the month. As you move to the eastern part of the state on that same date, not the heavy rains, but strong winds, not related to thunderstorms. And then a couple hail reports there in the eastern part of the state on the 26th. But really, all in all, certainly the areas that were impacted by those storms and people that suffered damage, we feel for those folks. But when we look at the national media and some of the storms that have impacted the country, conditions in Kentucky have been comparatively benign in regards to some other places. Agricultural impacts across the state, and ag certainly a consideration when we're looking at hydrologic conditions and drought, because they tend to be on the forefront of impacts. There at the top of the slide, you've got a couple of photos taken from the field camera at the Kentucky Mesonet Station there in Hickman in Fulton County. and showing field conditions there on April 20th and 26th, and really highlighting some of the problems farmers have had, especially in the western part of the state, being able to get out in the fields, planting, and just being able to do field work in general. It's been difficult. Got a report earlier from Matt Dixon there at the UK Ag Weather Center, and kind of highlighting conditions across the state. Basically there, if you look at the information from NASS, looking at corn planted this week, about 28% out, an improvement over last week, and close to the 5-year average. Corn emerging there, so about average. And you look at most of those comparisons, we're not too far off the 5-year average in terms of agricultural conditions. On the right-hand side, looking at crop conditions, got wheat out there, that winter wheat, 53% good, 23% fair. Certainly hay is going to be an important consideration this year. Pasture 51% good, 31% fair at this point, the major categories. It's returned in more normal precipitation over the last month and more has certainly helped with improving farm conditions or field conditions, but again, some areas have been wetter and it's been more difficult for farmers in those areas. I think there's a lot of concern and it's highlighted with pastures. We've got growth starting to emerge again in pastures, and it was a really difficult winter for cattle and hay. A lot of demand, a need for hay for cattle, energy consumption, but also we had poor quality hay last year, so really counting on that pasture growth and hoping for a good hay crop this year. And this last slide in terms of impacts just highlights, again, some Kentucky mesonet observations. Talked about earlier, field cameras. They also have a near infrared capability to produce an NDVI image, that's normalized difference vegetation index. It kind of monitors the health of vegetation and development of vegetation. And this is really, at this point, this is all very experimental. But you can see 2 images that were taken at our mesonet site in Webster County at Dixon. And just kind of look on the left side, a couple things to point out. You can see the darker color, the red color is indicating growth, healthy vegetation, and that's grass there in the foreground. And you can see there on the right-hand side, a deciduous tree. And the picture in January, of course, there are no leaves, and that tree's leaved out. And so you can see the difference here, healthy growth at the end of April here in 2019. And then in the background, again, you can see the change in the trees. So we're starting to collect this data. We'll be working with it and archiving it so we can do comparisons through time of the same scenes. And we think this will be very useful information for us going forward. Okay. I'd like to shift now to the third section, and that is looking at outlooks going forward. We'll start out, again, our focus on precipitation. The quantitative precipitation forecast, 7-day total precipitation from the Weather Prediction Center. And you can see that there's a system there in the plains stretching up to the Ohio Valley that is expected to impact us with expected rainfall totals over the next 7 days, anywhere in the about 1.5 to 2, 3, as much as 4 inches of rain possible. And really, again, concentrating on near the Ohio River in those counties that have been wet, and the western part of the state that's been wet, bringing a little bit moisture back to the eastern half where we had been drying out. So we'll see how that materializes here over the next few days going forward. And then looking out 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day precipitation outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. And you can see both of those maps for the entire country, with just the exception of the Pacific Northwest, a lot of green on there, indicating that there are elevated probabilities that precipitation will be above normal for that period. And so we're slightly elevated here in Kentucky for both those periods. So basically the next 2 weeks are more than likely to be a wet period here in the state. The monthly outlook, and this was just updated, first released there in the middle of April, but updated there at the end of the month on the 30th. So we've got fresh off the press outlook for the month of May. And on the left is highlighting temperatures. On the right, we'll look at precipitation. The outlook is hinting that we're likely here in Kentucky to be above normal in terms of temperature for the month. Even more so in the eastern part of the state. Expect a trough, bring colder temperatures in the plains. And for the ag community, certainly don't have any ill wishes for any of our farmers out there, but the plains area certainly struggled here as we begin the year with very cold temperatures over the winter and very deep frost depths and heavy snows and blizzards and flooding, particularly there in Iowa and Nebraska, and now remaining below normal temperatures and just having a difficult time from an agricultural perspective getting started this year. So again, when we say above normal, enhanced likelihood, so there we're talking somewhere between 40 to 50% chance that will be above normal, about a 1/3 chance that will be near normal, and then a depressed chance of, around 20% or less that will be below normal temperature. And when we talk about above normal, near normal for Kentucky in May, above normal average temperature would put us somewhere based between, say, 66 and 70 degrees. That near normal category puts us about 62 to 66. And below normal would be about 59 to 62. So when we say above normal, we're saying something in the range of maybe 3 or 4 degrees above normal. And precipitation, we look at that on the right side. Again, that same picture that we've been looking at, likelihood of above normal precipitation, particularly targeted there in parts of Texas, Oklahoma, the lower Mississippi Valley. And part of that reflects that recent, that 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast that would get the month off to a very wet start in that area. So we're looking in Kentucky at areas that are about 40% chance of being above normal precip. So, and again, then about 33% chance of being near normal and maybe around 25% chance of below normal. And again, what does that mean? Normal precipitation based on the 1981 to 2010 reference period. Near normal would be anywhere from about 4.3 to 6.2 inches of rain. Above normal, something from about 6.3 on up 7, 8, even 9 inches of rain. So enhanced likelihood of above normal, if that materializes, most likely somewhere looking at a 6-inch to 7-inch precipitation amount for the month. If that doesn't materialize, probably somewhere in the 4.5, 5.5 inch range, something like that. But as we all know, there's quite a bit of uncertainty. And then looking a little bit farther ahead in a seasonal perspective, again, enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures across the eastern portion of the country, and enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation, but again, only slightly enhanced for our region here in Kentucky. But again, we looked at that map for the U.S. Drought Monitor, and not much drought activity, and going forward, we don't expect that to develop per se across the country at this point. And again, this is a historically significant period in terms of the lack of drought across the country. The one thing that we're pretty confident is that it's not going to stay that way forever. Okay. Looking forward, not so much from the drought side, but as we talk about above normal precipitation from the Ohio River Forecast Center, And again, this doesn't capture every bit of Kentucky. You get over the Jackson Purchase region, and that's not covered out of the Ohio River Forecast Center. But you look at most of the state, and we're projecting stream flows to be in the normal category to, again, maybe a few areas a bit above normal. But as you get north of the Ohio River, you can see, again, that area has been wetter, and expecting to see stream flows continue to be above normal. And that would contribute to higher stream flow levels in the lower Ohio, Mississippi basin there. Here's another product from NOAA in terms of river forecasting. This is a map that shows over the next 3 months, May, June, and July, locations or gauges that have more than a 25%, 1 out of 4 probability of flooding over the next 3 months. And in Kentucky, again, the only thing that you see there are some gauges along the lower Ohio River area from around Henderson down through Morganfield and Marion, that area of the state. And again, that's really reflecting the wetter conditions up in Indiana and in parts of Illinois. Otherwise, no indication of an enhanced risk of flooding in Kentucky. And then going along with that, in terms of probability of 75% or a much higher probability of flooding, we don't see that at all at this point. So to summarize all of that information, just 3 bullets here. It's been an extraordinarily wet start to 2019, but that's given way to precipitation that is averaged near normal across the state. And again, that's an average across the state. Some areas a little bit higher, some a little bit lower. We need to note that soil moisture is well above normal. Stream flows are near normal over most of Kentucky. Again, we had a few places above normal, but that leaves us vulnerable to flooding if heavy rains return, because there's not much opportunity to absorb that moisture. Otherwise, if we don't see those heavy rains, or if that rain is well distributed, then just seasonal climatological factors as we start to get warmer weather, more evapotranspiration and such, we would expect to see that vulnerability start to decrease. So otherwise, when we look ahead over the next month, over the season, we're anticipating above normal precipitation and temperature, again, over the next month and over the next season. So that gives a summary of conditions here across the state. And we're now going to try to shift into an opportunity for questions and discussion if we can figure out how that works. And so hold on. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, we'll try to take that on. And again, as to give some time for that, in the meantime, again, like to emphasize that we very much would like for you to give us feedback. Tell us if the information presented is helpful, is informative, if there are things that that we're missing, and if we need to get input from more folks, give us some ideas. We're certainly interested in being comprehensive and incorporating as much information and as many sources of expertise as possible.
Are there any questions out there?
Okay, well, it sounds like we've satisfied everyone with, hopefully we'll look on the bright side. We've satisfied folks with the information we've provided today. Again, this is a bit of a dry run. Wanted to see how things go, gather some feedback, and then going forward, we will be doing quite a bit more advertising to engage different sectors here across the state. So any feedback that you have will be, again, extremely valued here as we get ready to ramp this up and expand the audience here beginning in the month of June. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating this month, and look forward to your feedback and being with you again in June. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.